23. Theodore Brameld, Democracy and Consensus. In the writings of Theodore Burghart Hurt Brameld, born 1904, a forthright attempt has been made to cope with some of the developing problems confronting progressivism in education. In some respects, Brameld has made the most notable attempt in education within the United States to broaden its foundations and increase its general relevance. In spite of these earnest efforts, Brameld's philosophy remains rather the culmination and end product of a perspective that began in U.S. education with man rather than a new beginning. The future may well be determined by Brameld's kind of concept, but it will remain an end-of-the-line product and a culmination philosophy, the doctrine of radical democracy come to full flower. Brameld is, like Dewey, an advocate of relativism up to a point. Even Deweyism, he is ready to grant, despite the loud protests we may expect to hear from certain advocates, is perhaps, ironically, the rather too dispassionate myth of the scientific technological culture through which we have been speeding. Myths are true or false, depending upon the extent to which they serve to unveil or to disguise the common character, the folk life of the periods when they are influential. In education, progressivism or reconstructionism must create a true myth. The myth to be created is a cultural therapeutic, first, to lessen the tensions and bewilderments from which too many of us suffer, second, to substitute for these a constructive aim in which we can join and for which we can fight, knowing that we are once more on the side of righteousness. How, quote, righteousness, end quote, can be man's concern in a totally relative and mythological world, we are not told. The myth becomes more and more real as we share in its fulfillment and as it expresses man's deepest communal instincts, experiences, and needs. Thus, it becomes an instrument for the apprehension of reality, since, for Reconstructionists, all beliefs about reality ultimately have a cultural context. This reality is best apprehended if the cultural determinants of human experience are properly governed and resolved. To see history as reality means to view it in terms of a philosophy of history as social struggle, as expansion and contraction of freedom, as organism, and as future. And all this spells democracy. Brameld's devotion to democracy is beyond question. It constitutes for him the wholeness and soundness of life, so that all else is fragmentary, partial, and unsound. The champions of democracy are defenders of truth, whereas all others are pressure groups representing cultural lags. Education must be in terms of a basic philosophy and is an expression of the faith and perspective of that philosophy. And it is democracy, after all, which rightly stands at the apex of our beliefs. In the realm of beliefs, it would seem certain that the deepest, most universal of all is an unqualified respect for the decency, worth, and promise of the ordinary human being. This human being has not only indispensable needs, but dynamic wants as well, and human living means far more than just keeping alive. It means the greatest possible development of the whole person, his abilities, his desires, his interest, his understanding. This means democracy and democratic education. Workers' education should also be in terms of these needs and wants as democratic goals. Workers, moreover, should be educated in terms of their democratic requirements, and the publicly supported university or college should include a school or department of labour. Public education, seen in its true perspective and development, can and should become one highly effective instrument in the struggle of organised labour against the inhuman forces which would destroy it. Brameld, however, believes he is most vehement in his rejection of statism. For him, the state is not an end in itself, but a means. Marxism regards the state as an evil destined to wither away, but it has nonetheless been unable to escape statism. But Brameld, while opposing statism, does not share Marx's ostensible horror of the state. With respect to the bugaboo of federal control of education, Brameld insists that the word control is entirely amoral. It connotes neither good nor bad as such. It becomes good or bad only in the context of specific methods and purposes, in other words, according to how control is exercised and for whose purposes. Again, federal authority as such is neither good nor bad. It becomes good or bad as it does or does not support the consensus of the majority in satisfying their universal wants. Thus, the powers of the truly democratic state are good powers and to be trusted. The history of democracy is that of a people's revolution, when the schools come under the indisputable control of that immense majority which alone is sure to care that free education should become the revolutionary weapon of a people's peace. Then they will be directed towards the future of democracy. It is Brameld's conviction that democracy, more than any form of society devised thus far by man, is capable of providing greatest happiness for the largest number of people on the earth. With Brameld, there is an equation of democracy and happiness on the basis of self-evidence. This self-evidence arises from the fact that, since these values flow from springs of nature of which each person is himself a part, each person must testify to their vitality and then, with others who so testify, arrive at mutual agreements that here are indeed the values which they share. Precisely in this sense, majority rule is also the expression of agreement by the largest number as to what, from mutual experience, those values mean to them. Majority rule or consensus thus appears as a major aspect of Brameld's philosophy. But what's of majority rule when the majority opinion differs with Brameld's definition of democracy or rejects it altogether? In dealing with such a school and community situation, Brameld does not speak of majority rule. Instead, he speaks of developing a future-looking perspective in students. At the beginning of the special projects in Floodwood, Minnesota, the students' attitudes were described as cynical, pessimistic, and apathetic about man and society, according to one teacher, and special tests revealed the students believed the following things. Human nature cannot be altered. The profit system is the only possible incentive. Sports must have competition, for what else is there to strive for than a victory over others? Big business is good for the country. Its profits and motives are acceptable. The wealthy have a right to excessive profits, for haven't they acquired them because of their diligence and abilities? Munitions and manufacturers cause war. Everyone has a right to free speech, press, religion. Crime is inevitable. Why the prisons and punishments then? They glibly repeat the Bill of Rights and the Four Freedoms, but they have no realistic conception of their true meaning and implications. They cannot envisage their status under a fascist state which they do not believe is coming. They have no conception of the difficulties and obstacles they will meet upon leaving Floodwood. Happily, these students did not long remain in this benighted state. They were soon equally glib with other opinions. The group was taught to build a definition out of its own experiences and expectations as to what it would suppose a good society should provide. The problem arising from this inductive discussion of wants was, what kind of society will best guarantee the maximum fulfillment of our wants? Here, humanism and democracy come to full flower. Not God, but man is the measure. The past is cancelled. A man makes his own law, science, society, and future in terms of his wants. In place of the Bible as the infallible word to order all things by, we have man's infallible wants, as properly and democratically understood under guidance. Before too long, the students were expressing themselves thus. Before reading something about art in a democracy, I didn't think the government should assist or help artists, but now I have changed my mind. Art is important to the government as a whole. The movies and radios are also used for getting people to believe and think along certain lines. However, there should be more education in the radio programs than there is. As for having the government take over the radio entirely, that wouldn't be right, but it should regulate the programs more. Science could do better than it does if it were not so clamped down. Companies such as DuPont can hire the best chemists and thus monopolize many products produced by their chemists. They can do this because they have money and power. This should be broken because it hinders progress. In the economic political area, no student now inclined to the right, a minority were to the left, but the majority inclined strongly towards a centre solution, especially of the type recommended by Charter for America. True education is thus equated with a politico-economic orientation rather than with scholarship in any historical sense. The task of the schools has become religious conversion to a politico-economic statist order rather than education. Indeed, insistence on education proper is a sign of reaction. If the critic of the schools, like Robert M. Hutchins, is himself a champion of the same liberal politico-economic order, then he is separated from the voices of the old reaction and called the new reaction. Anything short of total subscription to the new education is a heresy which bespeaks the presence of the cloven hoof and the demonic forces of reaction. Democracy is Brameld's goal, method and answer in every situation, and hence his intense concern for the integration as an educational goal as well as a social one. He sees democracy as value, and hence all else is to be judged in terms of this non-supernatural absolute. The religious task of the schools is seen as a philosophical one by Brameld, a merely verbal difference, in that democracy is, by his own statement, the basic premise and faith. For him, philosophy is the pattern of basic beliefs, political, economic, religious, moral, aesthetic, scientific, which provides those who accept that culture with a sense of consistency and significance. Accordingly, education, in its most universal meaning, may be regarded as the effort to translate this philosophy into practice by showing those members of a society who are considered most important to its welfare how to serve it most fruitfully. If philosophy articulates the beliefs of a culture, education helps to carry them out, and in doing so, generates additional experience useful to that articulation. First of all, the honesty of this position is clearly apparent and, of course, commendable. Second, its radical break with the science and humanism of which it is the ostensible fulfillment is even more apparent. The old, secular order wherein man lived in detachment of faith and in terms of science has been buried irretrievably. A new democratic one world and one faith is the new medievalism and holy faith, but it is also the old secularism baptized and tonsured. Education must work to preserve and further this new faith against the assaults of the infidel. Brameld's central theme is that education can and should dedicate itself centrally to the task of reconstructing a culture which, left unreconstructed, will almost certainly collapse of its own frustrations and conflicts. Like Dewey, Brameld believes himself to be a pragmatist and is ready to apply a corrosive relativism against all positions other than his own. Thus, in speaking of the third major concealment of the essentialist position in education, Brameld asserts, the whole doctrine of a pre-existent and indubitable reality becomes a powerful cultural device to reinforce attitudes of compliance with objective institutional arrangements or subjective wishes and habits, or both. This statement, of course, is premised on a faith without evidence. For Brameld, progressivism does not necessarily believe even in a universe, but it does believe in democracy and one world. Creation is not necessarily a unit or one world, but man is and must be. Only occasionally does Brameld seem conscious of the arbitrariness of his position. Why should human freedom or democracy, for him the two are inseparable and virtually synonymous, be of value in a relative world? Why human freedom? Why not some other encompassing goal, love for example? I am forced to admit an element of arbitrariness in this selection, but my defence is that given the kind of planet we live upon today, no other value is of equal urgency. The urgency is the rise of threats to democracy from dictatorships abroad and menaces within. These menaces serve to reveal that Brameld's position is, in his own words, an unqualified belief in democracy. Brameld does seek support or proof texts for his faith in democracy in the sciences, that is, in psychology and anthropology in particular, both of them new disciplines and still largely philosophical in their essence. Brameld's position is one of faith, and hence his philosophy of education is a demand for democratic indoctrination. Thus, he can title chapters, The Philosophy of Education as Philosophy of Politics. Moreover, democracy is its own proof. Man's needs, wants, and wishes have an infallibility when democratically expressed. Hence, consensus is basic to his approach. Of course, a cultural consensus is not necessarily a personal consensus, although Brameld is unwilling to speak strongly against majority rule. His belief in the consensus is a part of his concept of society. Consensus always pervades cultural patterns. Very few cultures, however, are dedicated to freedom. How then can Brameld assert? Meanwhile, this much we can affirm at least for educational theory. The ultimate justification for our commitment to the goal of freedom lies in the social consensus, a consensus that most of us do or share, that real people living in the real cultures reach in behalf of that commitment. This is as much an absolute and as authoritarian as anything organized religion presents. As for Brameld, organized religion is to be barred from education because it is authoritarian. But Brameld's democracy outdoes organized religion with its authoritarianism as well as its demands and credulity. Note Brameld's scientific conclusion regarding values. The final criterion of intercultural values is the social consensus that can be attained about them. What does the consensus give us? According to Brameld. And when it is done, is the social consensus always identical, always unanimous? Of course it is not. To a remarkable extent, however, that consensus epitomized by self-realization may be stated like this. Most men do not want to be hungry. They cherish the value of sufficient nourishment. Most men do not want to be cold or ragged. They cherish the value of adequate dress. Most men do not want uncontrolled exposure either to the elements or to people. They cherish the value of shelter and privacy. Most men do not want celibacy. They cherish the value of sexual expression. Most men do not want illness. They cherish the value of psychological and mental health. Most men do not want chronic insecurity. They cherish the value of steady work, steady income. Most men do not want loneliness. They cherish the value of companionship, mutual devotion, belongingness. Most men do not want indifference. They cherish the value of recognition, appreciation, status. Most men do not want constant drudgery, monotony, or routine. They cherish the value of novelty, curiosity, variation, recreation, adventure, growth, creativity. Most men do not want ignorance. They cherish the value of literacy, skill, information. Most men do not want continual domination. They cherish the value of participation, sharing. Most men do not want bewilderment. They cherish the value of fairly immediate meaning, significance, order, direction. Assuming for the moment the accuracy of this consensus, a question arises. If this indeed is the human consensus, then is not man amazingly stupid not to have attained his ends, and rather to have worked so contrarily to his own desires? Moreover, if man is so stupid and perverse in attaining his values, how can he be trusted to express values? Brameld operates on the old humanistic premise of faith in the goodness of man, rather than the biblical doctrine of man the sinner. Both positions are equally religious. How can Brameld hold that reactionaries prevent the true order from being realized when he begins with the premise, the consensus always pervades cultural patterns? This means that every culture exists in terms of a cultural consensus, so that instead of a universal consensus for freedom, many contradictory consensuses exist. Brameld recognizes the reality of cultural pluralism, but he wants nonetheless an ethical universalism in a cosmos that may not even be a universe but a multiverse. Moreover, some of his values are in essence hopeful and idealistic expressions of faith or involve a prior presupposition. For example, what is mental health? Mental and physical sickness are more natural and common, more a consensus than health. Mental health, moreover, is a value variously defined by Aquinas, Calvin, Freud, and Dewey. Which definition is Brameld's value? And is this value of any significance as a value to communists, Christians, Hindus, Muslims, animists, and others? How can a consensus of conflicting values give a single value? To assume that there is a common core of religion behind all religions, or a common core of values behind all ethics, is to assume a radically self-contradictory faith, and one totally without warrant. Brameld is therefore far more guilty of authoritarian dogmatism than the organized religion he discounts. His entire system of values runs in direct contradiction to the anthropological and psychological evidences he adduces so earnestly and conscientiously. His majority-defined values are simply Brameld-defined values and no more. He more accurately expresses his position, entitling a chapter, "Toward a Democratic Faith." It is a future consensus. He often shows awareness of the fact that men today, and America in its origin, are at odds with him. But his trinity of values, democracy, freedom, and happiness, are in essence one God, inseparable though triune, and hence man cannot truly seek one without seeking all. Therefore, the true consensus can only be the democratic consensus. Here, moreover, is the reconstructed democratic import of intelligence. It is human nature become collectively aware of and agreed upon what human nature wants, and of the steps necessary at a given time to satisfy its wants. The social consensus as law is a practical necessity in order to avoid total relativism or an untenable resort to a supernatural or metaphysical authority. Majorities are thus supreme judges of values, for if we accept democracy, we must accept also the belief that no more reliable or ultimate criterion of practical social judgment can be found in political experience than that reached by the method of communication and agreement about evidence by the widest possible majority. In view of this, the giant political task of our time is, then, to build a new and far more genuine consensus Since this is a reconstructed and collectively aware intelligence and consensus which, only when so is, genuine, it becomes very clear now that Brameld's consensus is that old mainspring of all modern tyranny, Rousseau's general will, the old priest now writ large. Much as Brameld may hate the comparison, his democracy and Hitler's National Socialism have a common origin and are sisters under the skin. Both alike create and require a new and more powerful order of Platonic guardians to become the focus, expression, and idea of man in the name of the folk, people. They become the voice of the consensus or general will. This authoritarian consensus is somehow good, whereas the authoritarianism of God is the defect of organized religion. Man is safe with powers God dare not be trusted with. What about the old-fashioned champions of liberty who cling to Calvinist, constitutional or other grounds in their resistance to this new Leviathan? One of Brameld's comments on democracy is sufficient answer. For democracy is that form of society in which all physical and spiritual resources of life are in fact available to and under the control of the majority of people, and in which the minority is always free to criticize while obedient to politics authorized by the majority. Thus, if churches, private schools, private property, or any other thing be outlawed by the majority, the minority has no right to do other than obey the great God consensus, beyond whom and apart from whom no value exists. Polite criticism will be charitably granted to the warped minority, but no more. For no law exists beyond the consensus. Not only is economics eroded of law, but science as well. To paraphrase a famous dictum about history by one of our great 19th century thinkers, Marx, the operational philosophy of science means, above all, that man makes science. Science does not make man. This is progressivism or reconstructionism in education. Against it, essentialism and perennialism are weak and impotent, and are philosophies more often found in critics of education rather than among educators themselves. Moreover, these two dissident positions are in a measure early and retarded forms of progressivism and are equally statist in orientation. In progressivism and in Dewey, the philosophy of life formulated in Descartes on the premise of autonomous man has come to full fruition. Even as philosophy from Augustine to Duns Scotus and Occam explored and exhausted a particular foundation in philosophy and led to the reign of the dunces, so the mind-out vein from Descartes to Kant and Dewey is already leading to a similar reign of dunces. The dunces, then, as now, are often brilliant and dedicated men, but they move beyond absurdity in attempting to dig new ore from exhausted veins. Herman Dooyeweerd, who together with Vollenhoven and Cornelius van Til has, after Abraham Kuyper, broken radically with the philosophy of autonomous man, has described the fundamental motive of the modern era as nature and freedom. These, although radically in contradiction one to another, have been the presuppositions of modern philosophy and the sources of the modern mythology of man. Nature has lost its normative status, and humanistic freedom has been replaced by security as a human ideal. Educators reflect the tension and insecurity of cultural crisis and collapse. Some, like Brameld, seek to help create a new order because, in advance of others, they recognize the crisis. But, although he fails to recognize it, Brameld's future is a return to the worst evils of the old order and is in essence a recapitulation of them.